Mis amores. Hello, hello. Onward, we move forward with my story, with my life story. And now we are into my adolescence. This part of my story, I feel like, is a good contrast. It kind of shows a flow state and then somewhat of a collapse. Also, touching on what I did to survive. So, yet again, getting nice and vulnerable here and transparent. High school, the first like year and a half of high school was awkward for me. I was still kind of trying to find my footing, I guess. Although I wasn't like socially awkward or anything, I just felt like awkward. Like it's hard to put into words, but if you know what I'm talking about, then you know. However, then I come into my later years in high school, and I was very much in the flow of everything. I was in sports, and primarily starting my junior year, I focused on volleyball. That is like the love of my life, the first love of my life. Academically, I was in honors classes, and socially, I was kind of a part of all the groups. There wasn't necessarily like a cliquey experience for me because, like I said, I was the jock, I was the nerd. I was also very much into rock music, punk rock, heavy metal. So, the gothic punk crowd I was also a part of. So, many worlds. Honestly, I was just following joy. Whatever was fun for me, I kind of just did it. It was a very free flowing time for me because I didn't really have many cares. I, started to drive also in high school. So, I was just hanging with my friends, having a good time. And I personally was quite innocent. I wasn't drinking or partying. Obviously, there were still like growing moments and some challenging moments, but for the most part, high school memories are good memories for me. Then comes college, the turning point. Oh, college. First and foremost, I could not wait to leave my parents' house. I I was out of there. However, now looking back, I was homesick. I was not ready to leave my support system, to have complete and total independence. It was definitely a huge initiation, that's for sure. A loss of structure, essentially. So I'm out of my comfort zone. I'm homesick. I'm in completely new territory. Everything has changed. There's one friend that came with me from high school. Other than that, my volleyball coach is different. Obviously, all the students, the staff, the location, everything has changed. And I was having a really challenging time finding my anchor. And on top of all of that, not long after that freshman year in college, I lost a dear friend it was like November of so like 3 months, is it? Into my freshman year, a dear, dear friend. And so that grief really just piled on. And then the year following that, I then lost my grandmother. And I say lost, but obviously I know that I did not lose them. They just transitioned out of the physical world. However, it was essentially back to back. And no, I didn't process either of those in the way that I should have. I had zero tools for it. Even if I wanted to, I wasn't shown how to grieve properly, how to care for my spirit, how to even interpret what was happening. So I was just kind of doing my best. So what I ended up doing as a coping mechanism is I just started to numb. I did that by drinking. I started drinking very heavily. At first, it was, it felt very kind of just like, well, let's see, experimenting, I guess we can say. However, it definitely got me out of reality in a way that just felt like a relief, that I was then starting to do it more and more and even more heavily. So I was definitely abusing of the alcohol in a way that I was actually a functioning alcohol by the towards the end of my college years. It was like going to classes and immediately afterwards starting to drink, and then at some point I also drank during class. Like it was a little out of hand. It was out of control. I even got a DUI at towards the end of my college career. Drinking was just a part of it. I also developed an eating disorder, bulimia, anorexia, and I always had low self-esteem, not always, but it was very prevalent for most of my life up until that point. I think the stress and the grief that I was experiencing kind of pushed me more towards the eating disorders at that point. I was also leaning into promiscuity, and yeah, that partly was for numbing, but that one is also more complicated because I know that that's how I was getting my needs met. And at that time I thought that that's all I had to offer, my body in that way. I was using all these different things to dissociate, to numb, and kind of just survive, get through this phase of life, because I really did in fact feel very alone in this process. And even at one point I tried reaching out to my familial units, and they did their best as well, but they also did not have the tools to cope with that grief in a healthy way. So me actually reaching out for help kind of just reminded me that I was in it on my own, that I had to kind of just shove it all the way down and just keep it moving. There's many things that I do wish I would have done differently. However, I don't live in that regret, because what's done is done. I've already done a lot of work to forgive myself and to heal myself, fully acknowledging that that was my path, that I had to walk in the trenches essentially and reap all the wisdom that it had for me. In the moment, it was very just kind of like YOLO, like I don't give a fuck. However, I did not make those choices because I didn't care. They were in fact choices that I made because I didn't know how to feel. I did not know how to feel my feelings. And I don't share this to stay there energetically. I share this to show how I completely just left myself. I strayed so far off my path to survive, and eventually circling back and finding me, loving me, healing me. And it took a lot of work. However, I wouldn't change it for the world. So those adolescent years, yeah, were very unstable, very just rough, man. I sound corny saying this, but stay tuned. Next, I go into that adulthood. We dive deeper into the dark night of the soul. And then eventually, finding my way back.